This is a KH-32 missile. It was designed to sink this Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. This is the concert hall in Vinnytsia, Ukraine. It's definitely not an aircraft carrier. When you fire this missile that's made to sink this at the concert hall in Vinnytsia, Ukraine, this is what's left. Firing a missile designed to sink an aircraft carrier, a very large and sturdy target, at a building in the center of a city, a much less sturdy target, has the potential of creating widespread death and devastation, which it did. This is an S-300 missile system. It's an air defense missile. This is an F-15 Eagle, and this is a B-52. This was designed to shoot down F-16s and B-52s. This is National University of Shipbuilding in Mykolaiv, Ukraine. This is definitely not an F-15 or a B-52. 3 of these were fired at this. This is what was left afterwards. The S-300 is the predecessor of the S-400 that was used to shoot down Malaysian Airlines Flight MH17. One of the major differences between the S-300 and the S-400 is the S-400 uses only radar to find its target. The S-300 can be programmed to find its target using either radar or inertial guidance. Inertial guidance is not very good at all for hitting an airplane in the air, but very good at finding a point on the ground. They can hit a target 150 kilometers or about 95 miles from its launch point. It has a fragmentation warhead that will not do a lot of damage to structures, but does horrific damage to people nearby. The missile body will continue on after the warhead explodes and does damage to buildings, but nothing compared to the shrapnel that it throws out does to people. Possible war crimes. It has been argued in recent years that the RAF night raids on German cities ordered by General Arthur Bomber Harris, RAF Bomber Command, constitutes a series of war crimes as they were designed to solely attack civilian targets. It helps to be on the winning side when the war tribunals are held. Harris believed that unhousing the civilian population with indiscriminate bombing would not only bring German industry a halt, but would also demoralize the German populace who would press their governments to sue for peace. His campaign failed at both goals. It didn't stop the German war industry, and all it did for the German populace was to harden their resolve to fight back against Britain. Russian artillery is either so inaccurate they cannot hit anywhere near the intended targets, or their planners just don't care whether they hit soldiers or civilians. I guess it's easier to hit towns where soldiers might be than it is to hit the soldiers themselves. Their supposedly smart missile systems are either not very smart or are being fired at the very limited limits of their range, so instead of flying a truly ballistic trajectory, they fly more of a parabolic trajectory, which means they end up hitting high-rise buildings near their targets rather than their intended targets. Or, again, they just don't care. The Russians are getting desperate for anything with an extended range to launch at Ukraine. They struck a shopping mall with the KH-32 missile that was designed, again, to sink U.S. aircraft carriers. The Russian use of antiquated location information has caused quite a few number of civilian casualties. The latest example of this was a submarine-launched missile attack on Vinnytsia. The Russians claimed that it was a strike against, quote, a meeting of the command of the Ukrainian Air Force with representatives of foreign arms suppliers at an officers' club. Well, that building was an officers' club during Soviet times, but today it's the city's concert hall. 23 are confirmed dead, including 3 children. However, that number is expected to rise as the rubble is cleared away. The Russian Spetsnaz, their special forces, operate more like terrorists than thugs intimidating civilians rather than highly skilled soldiers. The town of Bucha, civilians were tied up and executed, or simply used for target practice, bears witness to this. Attacks using long-range weapons against military targets during the spring and fall makes sense given the conditions in that area during those times of year. Using those same weapons against innocent civilians makes no sense at all. Bad decision making. Anyone who has studied World War II on the Eastern Front knows that early spring and late autumn military operations for the most part ground to a halt because of the mud on the Russian-Ukrainian steppes that made a war of maneuver impossible. That same mud was a contributing factor in the Russian army withdrawing from the already marshy area around Kiev. Using a formation heavy in armor in an area where tanks would be road-bound in any weather, till almost in Kiev, was foolish to begin with. Then add to the late start of operations, February 24th, almost guaranteed that tanks and armed personnel carriers would be easy targets as soon as the spring thaw arrived. There are only 2 times of year that a battle of maneuver can be fought on the steppe: late spring into early autumn and the coldest parts of winter, meaning that there are 5 to 6 months out of the year that vehicles traveling cross country will not be stuck fender deep in mud. So now that the time for maneuvering is here, the Russian army should be attacking, but they're worn out and demoralized from being thrown into the meat grinder around Kiev. They did better in the south, where mud was far less of an issue, and to look at the maps the media is printing, it looks like they did pretty good in the south and east of Ukraine. Those maps, however, don't tell the whole story. Crimean Peninsula and large parts of the Donbass were in either Russian or Russian-controlled insurgent hands before the war started. So all they actually did was succeed in seizing a corridor along the coast of the Sea of Azov that connected the Crimea with the Donbass area held by their proxies. They made very little progress toward the stated aim of capturing Odessa to cut the Ukraine off from the Black Sea. The Russians spent a large portion of their precision weapons, which by all accounts weren't all that precise, in the early stages of this war, and with embargoes and sanctions cutting them off from the electronics needed to replace those weapons, they have to use what they have left. Artillery fired by batteries that lack the training to be truly accurate. Tanks that have always made up for their shortcomings by being used in massive formations. Rockets, which are derivatives of the Katyusha rockets of World War II, and regular infantry. Soviet, and now Russia, has always predicated its offensive operations on being wielded like a massive club with little thought given to finesse. That idea won the Eastern Front simply by being able to outlast the Germans in a war of attrition with no thought given to how many casualties they suffered against a peer opponent. Western weapons and training. The world has changed in the last 80 years. Wielding a massive club of an army has been proven to be a losing opposition since the first Gulf War, if not earlier. The Than Hao Bridge in Vietnam had taken everything we could throw at it until the first laser-guided bombs ever used in combat dropped it once and for all. Our weapons have gone from being merely smart over the years to being practically brilliant today. We supplied the Ukrainians with something even more important than some of our best weapons. We supplied them with training. Not just the training on how to use the weapons, but also training on tactics. Teaching sergeants to know what their job is and how to do it, freeing up lieutenants and captains to do the work that they need to do, and so on up the line. The lower ranking NCOs and officers now know how to think on their feet, to plan and take initiative when the chance presents itself. The Russians lack that training, which is best displayed by the number of senior officers, colonels and generals, that they have lost during this war. Now we've supplied Ukrainians not only with artillery that outranges anything the Russians have and can hit a specific target some miles away, but also multiple rocket launch systems that can be used to either deliver a devastating barrage over an area or that can be set up to hit a specific building up to 50 miles away, and that can also fire rockets with the same accuracy at targets over 180 miles away. They put these weapons to good use. Recently, by destroying 2 warehouses the Russians were using as ammo dumps, as well as taking out the command post of the Russian Second Army Corps, killing its commander, as well as a number of his subordinate commanders. His head of planning, as well as 150 other members of the headquarter detachment. Another strike using precision weapons killed all but one of the deputy commanders of the 106th Airborne Division. We have trained our special forces to be true operators behind enemy lines, as opposed to the Russian Spetsnaz, who, as noted earlier, operate more like terrorists and thugs, intimidating civilians rather than highly skilled soldiers. Questionable replacement troops. The Russian army is made of 2 distinct groups. Men 18 to 27 who are required to do 1 year of service, but who by law are not allowed to be deployed outside of Russia, and contract soldiers who have volunteered for a 3-year stint in the army. This group can be deployed anywhere the government wants to send them. Many of those conscripts had been told they were going on training maneuvers, only to find themselves on the front lines in another country. To avoid public outcry, the Russian army never announced a stop-loss on contract soldiers. A stop-loss is when members of the militaries whose contracts are about to expire are retained until further notice. A stop-loss was used in the U.S. military after the 9/11 attacks, when the nature of the threat was still being assessed and was announced openly nationwide. It was later lifted. To avoid restarting a nationwide draft for fear of causing more public unrest and having to admit that the war is not a special military operations, the Russian army has started offering, by the standard of a country where the average salary is around $700, huge cash incentives for members of their National Guard to sign up for 90-day deployments of between $2,000 and $6,000. Soldiers who entered into short-term contracts, as well as those with 3-year contracts that had expired, were being browbeaten and threatened with legal action to coerce them to stay before they were allowed, eventually, to go home. Before the war, contract soldiers had an upper age limit of 40, but that was lifted in May to allow men over 40 to enlist. In the Donbass region, all men 18 or 65 are required to serve in the military, offering men with no military experience an enlistment bonus of $2,000, the equivalent of almost 3 months' wages, to enlist for 90 days, then give them 30 days of training before sending them to the front and paying them $2,000 every month, plus possibly even more when their contracted time expires, if they survive. Screams of extreme desperation for manpower. There are accounts of convicts being offered 200,000 rubles, or about $3,200, and total amnesty for their crimes if they'll volunteer to defend the motherland by signing up with the Wagner Group, mercenaries, for as little as 6 months. That is, if they make it back alive. Families of convicts are promised 5 million rubles, or about $79,000, according to the OCCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. The Donbass region of Ukraine has seen organized crime syndicates since before Donetsk and Luhansk regions declared separation from the Ukraine with Russian support in 2014. In a report from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crimes, GI-TOC, since Russia first encouraged, facilitated, armed, and bankrolled the rising of the rebellious pseudo-states of southeastern Donbass in 2014, there have been a pervasive connection between crime, war, and insurrection. This was a status quo that not only encouraged criminalization, but was based on it. Industrial-scale smuggling of everything from coal to narcotics helped sustain the internationally unrecognized pseudo-states of the Donbass. Gangsters became militiamen, and money laundering networks meanwhile being used to bypass sanctions. The density of criminality combined with the weakness of the local institutions across Ukraine, but especially in the Donbass, where talk of a crime-political nexus were commonplace, had for years offered opportunities for gangsters to convert money and muscle into de facto political power. All this allowed gangsters to become warlords, so much so that one warlord, known as Chort, or the Devil, is believed to have bankrolled a group known as the Russian Orthodox Army, which Russia sent to fight in Mariupol. The use of such criminally backed groups not only screams of desperation, but also invites the commission of war crimes, as such groups lack the discipline, lax as it is, of regular Russian troops. Reunification. Talk of Russia and Belarus reunifying has been in the rumor mill for a while now. As recently as July 1st of this year, Putin said unprecedented political and sanctions pressure from the collective West is pushing Russia and Belarus to speed up the unification process. The main reason behind this is that Putin needs Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko's troops to make up for his army's lack of trained troops. This proposal is fraught with peril for both Putin and Lukashenko. By all accounts, this is a very unpopular war with the Belarusian people, who are not afraid of staging mass protests, and which have required both police and army forces to put down. While according to some units of the army of Belarus have, in a letter to President Lukashenko, expressed concerns about being involved in Putin's war, saying, Russia's occupation of the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, which is a friend of our state, and its attempt to pull Belarus into a completely unprovoked war against a sovereign state can only be seen as the destruction of the sovereignty of Belarus. At present, the officers of the 5th Brigade of the Special Forces have observed the most serious infringement of Clause 1 of the Belarusian Constitution by Russia's highest political leadership. According to this clause, the Belarus Republic maintains its supremacy and full authority on its territory. It also enjoys independence over its internal and foreign politics. Sounds like they don't want to get involved. Fears of civil unrest. Mothers are being told that their sons are alive and well at the front, only to find out from social media accounts of their fellow soldiers that they have in fact been killed, have been raising the ire of many, so much so that according to some reports, Russian police have started keeping surveillance on families of service members killed in Ukraine to keep them from telling others the fake news of their son's death. Lukashenko himself may be wary of the civil unrest sending his troops to fight in Putin's war would cause when he asked Russia to prepare to deploy nuclear weapons against the West. His reasoning sounds like he'd rather be a president of a nuclear wasteland than be subservient to anybody. This kind of insane paranoia hasn't been seen since Yuri Andropov was head of the Soviet Union. Putin needs to get this war over with, and the sooner the better. While everyone is talking about whether Biden can get reelected in 2024, they overlook that Putin himself will have to stand for re-election in 2024. First glance, his re-election would seem a foregone conclusion, but they forget there were large protests in 2011 and 2012 when he was elected to a third term after 4 years as prime minister. The longer this war drags on, the less the Russian people will be satisfied with him being president. There has been simmering dissatisfaction with the Russian government for years, especially over socioeconomic issues, which, according to former presidential advisor Dr. Fiona Hill, is also beginning to make itself felt in more rural areas of the Russian Federation. Putin can only keep himself in power with rigged elections if he has the full support of his security apparatus. If he loses their support at putting down protests, he loses any veneer of legitimacy that he has, and become susceptible to what would amount to a palace coup. There are also rumors that he is not in the best of health, which, if true, would work against him in upcoming elections. Russians have a long history, and it wouldn't take much to make them remember the 1980s when Soviet leaders often ruled from a hospital bed, if they lived that long. That was an era of great upheavals and uncertainty which it is doubtful they would relish going through again. Conclusion. For all the hopes of wars of aggression and war crimes being committed by governments of large industrialized countries being a thing in the past, we shouldn't delude ourselves with its vision of utopia. Somewhere, at some time, always be a conquering dictator on the make, just waiting for what he feels is the right time to strike out and stake his claim to his parts of the world. 80 years ago it was Adolf Hitler. 30 years ago it was Slobodan Milosevic. Today it is Vladimir Putin. There will always be another someday. It is, unfortunately, a certainty. That's all for today, folks. Feel free to have a go at me in the comments. If you like what I'm doing, visit my Patreon so I can keep bringing you better and higher quality content. So long, farewell, drink one for me.